This is the story of how the United States military captured the president of a foreign nation on the 3rd of January 2026 in what officials call the most significant American military intervention in Latin America since 1989. Delta Force soldiers extracted Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela, from his compound in Caracas, and he now sits in a Brooklyn detention center facing narco-terrorism charges. The headlines focus on drug trafficking and international law, but there's a massive economic dimension most people are missing. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, and understanding what just happened means looking at the economics, the geopolitics, and the long-term implications for American power. Let me walk you through what actually occurred. President Trump gave final authorization at 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on January 2 from Mar-a-Lago, telling officials good luck and Godspeed. Around 2 a.m. Venezuelan time on January 3, approximately 150 U.S. military aircraft launched from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere and struck Venezuelan air defense systems and ground targets across multiple states before Delta Force helicopters landed at Fuerte, Tiuna, the primary military installation in Caracas. Maduro and his wife tried to reach a reinforced safe room but were captured before they could lock themselves in, and one U.S. helicopter took gunfire but remained operational. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane said the couple simply gave up to military personnel. From there, they were flown to the USS Iwo Jima, transferred to Guantanamo Bay, then finally to New York. And Trump posted a photo showing Maduro handcuffed and wearing blackout goggles to announce the mission's success. The official justification centers on a superseding indictment in federal court, charging Maduro with narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons charges. This builds on an original March 26, 2020 indictment that alleged Maduro led the Cartel de los Soles and partnered with Colombian FARC guerrillas to traffic 200 to 250 tons of cocaine annually through Venezuela into the United States, and the State Department had offered a $15 million reward for his capture. At his January 5 arraignment, Maduro declared, "I was kidnapped. I am innocent and a decent man, the president of my country," with his next court date set for the 17th of March 2026. But here's where things get more complex than a simple law enforcement operation, because President Trump explicitly stated that very large United States oil companies would move into Venezuela to fix the badly broken oil infrastructure. Which brings us to the oil. Venezuela possesses 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, which represents approximately 17 to 18% of the world's total. That's more than Saudi Arabia's 267 to 297 billion barrels and dwarfs US reserves of 45 to 74 billion barrels. And the Orinoco Belt in eastern Venezuela alone contains an estimated 900 to 1,400 billion barrels of heavy crude. But here's the detail most people miss. This is extra heavy, sour, crude, similar to Canadian oil sands. Specialized processing equipment, diluents, and upgraders are required to refine it, which means not every refinery can handle it, and production costs run significantly higher than conventional crude. The story of what happened to Venezuela's oil production is where things get really interesting. Late 1990 seconds production hit 3.5 million barrels per day, then dropped to about 2.5 million by 2013 when Maduro took power. By 2019, when US sanctions really kicked in, production fell to 1.2 to 1.5 million barrels per day, and as of November 2025, Venezuela was pumping just 934,000 barrels per day. That's a 70% decline from peak production, approximately 2.5 million barrels per day lost. And here's what's worth understanding. This collapse predates US sanctions and stems from chronic mismanagement under the Chavez and Maduro governments. After a 2002 strike, PDVSA, the state oil company, fired more than 18,000 workers and caused massive expertise loss. And estimates suggest PDVSA needs $58 to $100 billion just to restore basic infrastructure, since some pipelines haven't been updated in 50 years. PDVSA's 2024 export revenue totaled $17.52 billion from approximately 805,500 barrels per day of exports, but approximately 80% of current exports go to China. Chevron's US licensed operations account for only 120,000 to 150,000 barrels per day, down from the 800,000 barrels per day Venezuela supplied to the US before sanctions. That 800,000 represented a huge portion of imports, but now Venezuelan crude makes up just 1% compared to 51% from Canada. Why does this matter for the US economy? US Gulf Coast refineries operated by Chevron, ExxonMobil, Marathon, Phillips 66, and Valero were originally designed to process heavy Venezuelan crude. Citgo, which is actually PDVSA's US subsidiary, operates 3 refineries with combined capacity exceeding 800,000 barrels per day, specifically configured for Venezuelan feedstock, and these refineries have adapted to Canadian and Mexican heavy grades, but Venezuelan crude remains optimal for their equipment. Restored Venezuelan production could, in theory, supply American refineries with oil perfectly suited to their equipment and potentially lower costs while increasing refining efficiency. That's the optimistic scenario President Trump is selling. But here's where economic analysis gets interesting, because Brookings Institution analysts expressed skepticism when they stated, "I am skeptical that the invasion of Venezuela is centrally about oil. There are less costly and risky ways to produce oil, and on top of that, the world oil market is already poised for oversupply." Energy experts project production recovery timelines that tell the real story. Near term, meaning 1 to 2 years, Venezuela could reach 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day with current operators expanding. Medium-term recovery, meaning 2 to 3 years, could add another 500,000 to 1 million barrels per day with $10 billion per year in investment. But full recovery to peak production would take 7 to 10 years and $80 to $100 billion to reach 3.5 to 4 million barrels per day. Francisco Manaldi from Rice University estimates at least a decade and over $100 billion to hit 4 million barrels per day. And here's the thing about oil markets right now. The price impact has been minimal. WTI crude fell to $57.32 per barrel on January 3, declining about 20% through 2025. But markets are oversupplied, and the International Energy Agency projects supply exceeding demand by 2 million barrels per day in 2026. Energy analyst Bob McNally called the Venezuela situation almost a nothing burger for immediate oil prices. China stepped in while the US stepped back from Venezuela due to sanctions, investing over $105 billion in loans and grants since 2000. Approximately $12 billion in debt remains outstanding. China receives 80% of Venezuelan oil exports and uses shadow fleets and digital assets to circumvent US sanctions. And in 2025, China Concord Resources Corp began developing 2 oil fields in a $1 billion deal targeting 60,000 barrels per day. Russian involvement includes the Rosneft partnership established in 2013, a $1.5 billion loan using 49.9% of Citgo as collateral, and military advisors deployed to Venezuela. Maduro approved a 15-year extension of joint ventures with Russian-linked companies in November 2025. Removing Maduro means the US isn't just capturing a narco-terrorist, but potentially displacing Chinese and Russian economic and strategic interests from America's backyard. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth warned both powers, "We're re-establishing deterrence that's so absolute and so unquestioned that our enemies will not dare to test us." And American Enterprise Institute analysis concluded the operation demonstrates there's only one great power in the Americas when it comes to military muscle. Regional reactions matter for long-term American economic interests, and that's where the economics get more complicated. Colombian President Gustavo Petro deployed 30,000 troops to the Venezuela border and warned he would take up arms if similar interventions occurred in Colombia, while Brazilian President Lula stated the bombings cross an unacceptable line, and Mexican officials condemned the strikes as breaching the UN Charter. A January 4 emergency meeting of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States ended without consensus after 10 nations led by Argentina blocked a statement condemning the US. revealing a sharp ideological divide in the region. But 6 major nations, including Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, issued a joint statement expressing profound concern and firm rejection of the military actions. The pre-existing Venezuelan migration crisis involves 7.9 million refugees, the largest displacement in Latin American history, and Colombia hosts 2.8 million Venezuelans alone. Analysts warn Maduro's removal could trigger another mass exodus, and Colombian President Petro warned the situation could turn Venezuela into another Syria, with power vacuums triggering armed competition. Regional stability matters for American economic interests because trade relationships, supply chains, investment security, and diplomatic cooperation all depend on hemispheric trust. The operation revives historical fears of Yankee imperialism dating back to the 1989 Panama invasion and earlier interventions. Is this capture a big move to empower the US economy? The answer depends on your time frame and is more nuanced than most headlines suggest. Right now, probably not, because Venezuela currently produces less than 1% of global oil supply, markets are oversupplied, oil prices barely moved, and the infrastructure is devastated and would require a decade and $100 billion to restore. If American oil companies can stabilize production and restore output to even 2 million barrels per day within a few years, that represents significant additional supply perfectly suited to Gulf Coast refineries in the medium term. Chinese control over a strategic resource in the Western Hemisphere gets reduced, Russian influence gets displaced, and the economics start to shift. Long-term strategic implications may be more important than the immediate oil economics, because the operation demonstrates unchallenged American military power in Latin America, removes Chinese and Russian footholds, and potentially brings the world's largest oil reserves back into the Western economic sphere. But real costs exist. Regional relationships are fractured. Migration concerns loom large. The legal case faces sovereign immunity challenges, and Venezuela's government continues operating under acting President Delcy Rodriguez with military backing intact. No clear transition plan exists despite Trump's assertion the US will run the country. The Brookings analysts may be right that there are less costly and risky ways to produce oil, but maybe this operation was never primarily about oil prices or immediate economic benefit. Maybe it's about long-term strategic positioning, great power competition, and ensuring that the world's largest oil reserves don't remain indefinitely in the hands of governments aligned with America's primary economic competitors. Maduro's next court date arrives on the 17th of March 2026, and between now and then, we'll learn whether this bold military action translates into economic advantage or becomes a cautionary tale about the limits of military power in achieving economic objectives. What's clear is that this story is far from over, and the economic implications will unfold over years, not weeks.